Muted. That is not going to work. Hi, everyone. How are you? It's Orit here. Thank you for joining me today as we are discussing my child just got a diagnosis. Now what? So, this is a very common question. But before we even dive into that, I want to introduce myself. My name's Ori Gately, and I am the founder and education coach and advocate here at the Advocate Corner. So I want to welcome you personally to coming today to the live event. And I'm also, what do I do? Well, I help families who are lost and overwhelmed within the education system kind of figure out what is best for their children so that their children feel that they are supported. I help them uncover the ways to help their unique learners learn the best way they can. So that is what I do. And I am so glad that you are here. If you are here live with me, please comment #live. And if you are watching the replay, you can absolutely comment #replay. All right. I'd love to see my friends here and our community, because this is definitely a growing community. And I'm so glad those of you who are able to make it to be able to participate in the conversation. It's such an important conversation. All right, so let's dive in, because one of the things I'd like to do is to kind of have these lives within a 15, 20-minute session, because I know as busy parents, we want to get in, get our information, and get out, because we are gosh, God knows what's on our plate. But one of the things that I do want to talk about today is what happens when your child does get that evaluation. So I want to check to make sure everything is going well on my end here. And I think everything is. If you do have any questions and I am not able to see them at the moment, know that at the end of the live, anything that you posted, any questions that you post, I will respond back. Okay, so I did want to just make you aware of that. All right, so let's dive into what happens after your child gets a diagnosis. And I see this often in parent posts and different groups saying, my kid just got diagnosed with ADHD or ASD, autism spectrum disorder. And those are the common ones that we see, but there are, of course, other ones like dyslexia or dysgraphia. And one of the things that I want parents to very much be aware that schools cannot diagnose a child, all right? They're not the medical professionals. It has to be done by a medical professional. So if you're looking for your child's school to diagnose your child, that's not going to happen, all right? And I'm going to tell it like it is. It is not going to happen. They cannot. They are not certified legally to diagnose children. What they can do is talk about what they're noticing. They're able to do observations and notice behaviors. So they have anecdotes as to what's happening with your child, but they cannot say your child has A, B, or C. So that's where we have to go to the medical professionals. And now you're at the point where you had gotten the appointment, you had got the diagnosis. Now what do you do with it? I want to share some things with you. I'm going to share kind of the referral process, because at this point, and one of the reasons why parents end up getting the diagnosis is because they know that there's something going on with their child, yet they're not maybe 100% sure of what is it really that's happening with them. So I want to kind of show you that once that diagnosis is available, you can present it to the school, yet you have to be aware that just because, and I'm going to stress this, just because your child has a diagnosis does not mean they will be eligible for special education services. So what do I mean by that, and how do you find that out? So let me add my presentation here about the referral process. So one of the first steps that you have to look at is, what is this referral process? What are the steps that you have to go through in order to see whether or not your child is eligible for special education services? That is different from a 504 plan. So first of all, there's a pre-referral intervention. It's what we refer to in the education system as response to intervention. It's called RTI for short. And basically what the school building tries to first do, and this is a school building accommodation and intervention is to see whether or not your child would fall under a tier 3 intervention in school or tier 2. Sometimes in schools, tier 3 is special education. Sometimes in schools, tier 3 is not special education. Okay, so it really depends on your school district and how they look at RTI, which falls under MTSS, which is the multi-tiered systems of supports. Now, in this referral intervention piece right over here, they're looking to see whether or not the interventions they can provide in school prior to a child being brought up to special education can work for them. So are there any reading programs that are done not in the classroom, but in a more intensified environment, like with a reading teacher, if they can support their child? And sometimes that's called AIS reading and AIS math. That's where you have the interventions to help a child through, but that does not necessarily is not necessarily eligible for an IEP. Okay, but that is part of that diagnosis where maybe the child has attention focusing needs, yet with a small group instruction, they're still able to access their appropriate, free and appropriate education. Once this intervention is shown not to work, then there's a multi-factored evaluation. And this is where a lot of parents are told you can request an evaluation from your child's school, and it has to be done in writing. Okay, so this is where the multi-factored evaluations come in, the various evaluations that are being conducted by the school. And this is where you would ask for a complete and full evaluation to be done. Once these evaluations are done, then there's a meeting called the eligibility determination meeting, or sometimes it's called an initial eligibility. This is where the team gets together, the classroom teacher. So you need a general education teacher, a special education teacher, a school administrator, which could be the special education director, or it could also be in a building administrator. And you have possibly the school psychologist, the occupational therapist, speech therapist, and sometimes even a physical therapist that come together to determine whether your child is eligible for special education services. Okay. If the child is deemed eligible, now remember, you have your diagnosis, you are providing that diagnosis to the school, yet does that diagnosis impact the ability for your child to access their appropriate education, which is free and appropriate education? That's what the team discusses here at the eligibility determination. If the answer is yes, the child does show significant need, now remember the word is significant, need for special education services, now you're moving on to the individualized education program. Okay, now sometimes we hear it as a plan. It really is a program that is provided, and it's actually under IDEA, where we're looking at, is this the appropriate program for the child in general education? If it is, what are the accommodations and goals that need to be provided for the child to maintain in the general education classroom? And if the general education classroom is not the least restrictive environment, it's most often called LRE, then is there a different environment for them to be able to access the free and appropriate education? Once this is conducted, and again, the team comes together to write the program, including the parents, then you talk about the least restrictive environment. Okay, so you don't discuss least restrictive environment first and then the program. You actually discuss the program first and then the environment in which that program will be provided. Once that's discussed, then you move on to the implementation of special education services and related services. The education services are provided by a special education teacher. Related services are provided by occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech therapists, and sometimes there are counselors. There could be guidance counselors if your child needs counseling at any point. There are going to be clinical professionals in the building that can provide that as well. So that's what the related services are. Once that starts, and again, as a parent, you have to sign off on everything that is going to be done with your child. Once that is done, then we're moving towards progress monitoring, annual reviews, and triannual reviews. Now, what happens? And it's a triannual reevaluation, sorry. During progress monitoring, they're checking to see whether the program that was set up for the child is appropriate or not. So, what or how, let me say it this way, how does the diagnosis of what your child has impact them with accessing their learning in the current program that's been designed for them? If it's working and they're noticing that your child is making meaningful growth, okay, and remember the word is meaningful here. So that's where sometimes things could get in the gray. But if your child is making meaningful growth as they're monitoring the program, then that means the program's working. You might not need to have an annual review of the program, but you would have a triannual evaluation. Now, sorry, let me backtrack. You will have an annual review to make sure that the program is working. If the program is not working, then you can go back at any point during the year, open up the IEP, and make adjustments to the program as necessary. So let me backtrack before someone jumps down my throat and says, you have an annual review. Yes, you do get an annual review. My mistake. What I meant to say was the triannual reevaluation is where your child gets reevaluated every 3 years to ensure that the program that they're in is still being successful, and then make any adjustments, because in 3 years, your child may have outgrown certain goals. They may have met the goals. They may have the accommodations are no longer needed. And therefore, that's where the reevaluation of a full reevaluation is done for your child. All right. So I just want to clarify that in case anything happens. All right. So what happens next? After that, I want to kind of explain to you why and what determines the eligibility for special education. I do see often parents say, well, my kid has a diagnosis, then I can get the IEP now. Not accurate, okay? So just because your child has a diagnosis does not give you that golden ticket to get the IEP. So how does a child with a diagnosis get or is deemed eligible for an IEP? Well, there are 6 pillars of IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disability Education Act. These pillars that are right over here are under free and appropriate public education. Is the child able to receive it in their current learning environment? Yes or no? Are the evaluations appropriate for the child? So whatever evaluations that were done during the multi-evaluations section of the process, were they all appropriate? Were they all done in a way that is appropriate for the child, in the environment that's appropriate for the child? And was it all conducted, right? Because if OT wasn't conducted, but your child has sensory needs, well, then OT needs to be done, right? Then is it individualized? Is the program individualized for that child? A common theme that happens and parents sometimes hear at meetings is, well, we don't do that here. I'm going to call the BS card on that one, because when it's individualized for that particular child, yes, it has to be done. Now, if the environment isn't appropriate for them, that's one thing, but the programs that the child needs to be successful can be done, and it would be individualized for that child, at least according to IDEA. The least restrictive environment is the child in an environment where they are going to be able to learn, to access their appropriate education, to be able to have the individualized work that they need, and is the environment the appropriate for them. Some children do not work well in a general education setting, even if they have a one-on-one, okay? So sometimes a self-contained class or an ABA class or a life skills class is one that's more appropriate for them, depending on whether the district has those programs in the district, right, in the building. So this is something that you have to think about. Then parent participation. This is key. Part of being a parent with a child that qualifies for an IEP is your active participation in those meetings. Often parents feel like, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. I don't know what questions to ask. And that's okay. That is totally okay. That's why professionals like me are around, because we guide you through the process. My clients are seeing that they have a voice, they have a choice, and they have the ability to make the best decisions for their children because they are empowered to be the parent participant at the meetings. Then part of the other piece of it is the procedural safeguards. Now, this is a document that you do get anytime there's an initial eligibility meeting. You do get it once a year, and it's also most often posted on your district's website. The procedural safeguards is the one document I would say you do need to read. And I know I've said it, in previous lives where it is not a New York Times bestseller. It is quite the dry read. Yet you do need to read it because it tells you your rights as a parent. And if you do certain things and when you don't do certain things, it's the regulations that the state has about what are your rights during these processes. So you definitely want to read the procedural safeguards. And if you have any questions on what they mean or what they say, we can guide you through that. But these are the laws, okay, of the state. So those are the 6 pillars. And in order for your child to receive special education, these pillars all need to be addressed. All right. Then what is the eligibility for special education? And I see there's that little mistake there, but I'm going to let it go. I'm not going to be the perfectionist I am right now. All right. So eligibility for special education services. In order for a child to be eligible, and this is where I think parents sometimes think, well, I have the diagnosis. How come my kid's not eligible? Your child needs to fall under one of these 14 categories. There used to be 13, but the reason why there is a 14th one, but developmental delay, which is right over here, ends at age 9. Okay, so this is a category for a child up to age 9. All right, and that's why there's 14, but then goes down to 13. So here's one of the big ones with autism spectrum disorder. Sometimes parents feel like, well, my child was just diagnosed with ASD, so yeah, they're eligible for an IEP. This is where your child-specific situation is going to be very different. Why? Because there's a medical diagnosis and there's the educational impact that it has on your child. Autism spectrum disorder is a medical diagnosis, yet does the diagnosis impact their ability to access a free and appropriate public education, right? So if it does not, if your child can access their education in a general ed setting and may just need accommodations to access that learning, then your child's eligible for a 504 plan. They may not be eligible for an IEP just because they have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. And this might anger some people, but it is true. It is the truth, okay? So specific learning disability can sometimes be one of the diagnoses. Each one of this, and this one actually is blindness, okay? So it's visual impairment, including blindness. This is what that's supposed to say. This is where these categories is where your child needs to fall under and show significant delays in one of these categories to be able to qualify for an IEP. All right. So please be aware that just because my child has a diagnosis may or may not qualify them for an IEP. Yet, if your child doesn't qualify for an IEP, yet does have a diagnosis, this is where the next step could happen. That's where you have the IEP versus a 504 plan. All right. What are they and how do they differ? In the IEP, you have goals and accommodations. Those are the 2 main ones. And any issues that you have would be put as state complaints. It is under IDEA, which is the federal law. And there are a lot of different opportunities for evaluations. That's where the triennials come in. That's where the triennial evaluations come in, the annual reviews. But the difference with a 504 plan is a 504 plan only does accommodations. And let me backtrack. The IEP also has special education and related services attached to it. The 504 plan is basically accommodations only. It is not a special education teacher who teaches the child, unless your child is in a co-teaching class and they get the benefit of it. It is not goals set for the child under the 504 plan. If there's any recourse, the recourse would be going through OCR, which is the Office of Civil Rights. Okay. Again, that is the federal law, the 504, Section 504. Yet the Section 504 and IDEA are two different federal laws. And this 504 plan is only to remove any obstacles for your child to access their free and public education in the general education setting, where the IEP looks at the program and also looks at the least restrictive environment. Okay, for a 504 plan, the least restrictive environment is the gen ed classroom. On an IEP, the least restrictive environment might not be the general education classroom. It might be self-contained. All right, so just know that those are the differences. And that's really what it is. This is kind of the piece of what happens when you have a diagnosis and what can also not happen when you have a diagnosis. All right. So if you have any questions or if there's any other further information that you'd like, please, you can comment below and leave any questions, or you can also reach out to me at Ori Gately, directly DM me, and I'll be more than happy to speak to you about any questions that you have. And make sure that you join us at the Advocate Corner Parent Group, where we provide you a lot of information, supports, and happy to help whichever way we can. All right. Thank you for joining me today. And of course, if you do have any questions, you can always also book a free breakthrough session with me today to be able to provide you with the appropriate resources, information, and possibly if it's something you feel that you need an advocate in your corner, I'm here to help. Have a wonderful Thursday, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Be well.